as you can see from the title. This is Jarrett chapter 14. The title of the chapter is The 60s, a Decade of Protest and Change. There's a lot of material in this chapter. I believe this PowerPoint has 74 vocabulary terms. We're going to be looking at the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, LBJ's Great Society. We'll be looking at civil rights, the Vietnam War, the space race, putting men on the moon. We'll be looking at a lot of different topics. So with that, let us get started. Our first slide has 5 terms, and I went ahead and numbered the terms so we can sort of keep up with that. Our very first one is John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, won a very narrow election in 1960, and I do have a video I will show you if I haven't shown you already on the 1960 election. He was the youngest man to be elected president to that point. His vice presidential candidate was Lyndon Johnson. Of course, when Kennedy is assassinated in 63, Johnson becomes president. And we'll cover that as we get to it. Number 2, the New Frontier. This is a nickname given to JFK's social programs. JFK, sought to use the powers of the federal government to solve the nation's problems. Now, again, this is pretty similar to the progressive era of the early 1900s, in which the progressive presidents, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Wilson, all sought to change, to fix societal problems with legislative solutions, whether it be child labor, whatever the case may be. And we're sort of seeing a kind of rebirth of that in this period of time, in which the federal government, first under JFK's New Frontier and then under Lyndon Johnson's LBJ's Great Society, they believed that they were essentially progressives, much in the same mold of the progressives of the early 1900s. Anyway, let's get back to this, back to his New Frontier. JFK, proposed tax cuts, one of the few things that he actually got done while president. Again, keep in mind, he was only president for a short time. He was inaugurated in January of 61. He was assassinated in November of 63. So we're really looking at a little over 2 years. He did propose and get tax cuts passed. Was really the biggest, most successful thing that he did in his short tenure. He also helped propose the creation of Medicare, which comes about later. He proposed civil rights legislation, which comes about again after he is dead, and increased aid to education. Now, there was some of that, but most of that again came after his death. Now, again, Kennedy is an interesting person in so many ways. Kennedy was young and energetic. He had a beautiful wife and young kids, and he and his brothers would go out on the West Lawn and play football, and he is what most Americans dream that a president should be. Of course, underneath that, there were some negatives. There was the philandering. He cheated on his wife a lot. There was the drug addiction. He had sustained an injury during World War II, and he had become hooked on painkillers and then other things. So he was what America thought we should have as a president, and he did have some very good proposals. And again, all this stuff right up here, with the exception of tax cuts, all of those items really took place after he passed away. So while he does not really get credit, he does deserve some credit for at least attempting to get these things discussed. Anyway, let's move forward. Peace Corps, one of the things that he did able to do while he was president, he encouraged young Americans, young late teen, early 20, college-age students to go to developing countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, share their skills, help the people of those areas build infrastructure, roads and dams and housing. And it was a relatively successful program and is still around to this day. The space race. Number 4, competition between the United States of America and the USSR in space exploration. Now again, the space race is what we call this competition between us and the Russians in space exploration, rocketry, and eventually putting man on the moon. Now, we lag behind the Russians in rockets. We lag behind the Russians in rocketry. They were the first to put a man-made satellite, Sputnik, in space in 1957. They were the first to put a man in space, Yuri Gagarin, a short time after that. So they were leading us in space exploration, but we were able to put a man on the moon before them. Let's continue. Number 5, John Glenn. In 1962, he became the first American to orbit the Earth. He was just one of many who would follow suit, the first of many American astronauts to go into space and eventually to the moon. Let's continue and go on to the next slide. For some reason, I was kicked off right there, and I am back. There we are, our next slide. I'm sorry, it's taking a little while. I don't know why my computer and or my iPad is working so slowly, but okay, we are back. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the first two men to step foot on the moon. This was in July of 1960, again fulfilling a promise that a first-term president, John Kennedy, at his first inaugural in January of 1961, he proposed putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. First man on the moon to walk on the moon was Armstrong, and then, of course, his partner was Buzz Aldrin. So these were the first men to step foot on the moon. The proposal by Kennedy was in 61, and it is completed in the middle of 1969. Fidel Castro, communist dictator of Cuba. He overthrew the leader of Cuba in 1959, a man by the name of Batista. Castro, after kicking Batista out in a relatively short-lived rebellion, it is played up more by the media than what actually occurred. Anyway, once Batista is out, Fidel Castro, a short time later, enters into agreements with the Soviet Union, giving the Soviets a foothold in the Americas. Now, of course, Fidel really wasn't a communist to begin with. He did morph into one. The real communist of the group was Che Guevara, one of the thugs who helped Castro overthrow Batista. Now, before the Castro Revolution, Cuba was arguably the most successful country economically in what we refer to as Latin America. Essentially, anything south of the United States and the country's islands in the Caribbean. I believe Cuba had the highest gross domestic product. I think they had the highest income on average in all of those countries. Shortly after Fidel enters into power and becomes a communist satellite country, as you can well imagine, the prosperity, it shrinks, it diminishes, it goes away. And essentially, Cuba, which is a beautiful island, it has a very long, rich growing season. Its tobacco, its sugar is world-renowned, but it basically became a third world toilet because of the agreements entered into with the Soviets by Fidel Castro. Communism is a horrible form of government. Socialism, which is the economic system usually associated with communism, is a horrible system. We'll talk about those things a little bit more later on. 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. This again is in 1961. The United States secretly trained a group of Cuban expatriates. These are men primarily who had come to the United States. When I say men primarily, I mean some of them were young boys, roughly the age of you out in the audience watching this, late teens, early 20s, but most of them were grown men who had left Cuba when Castro seized power. They left behind, in some cases, family, in some cases, most of their worldly possessions, money in the banks, artwork, their homes, so forth and so on. And so they, the Cuban expatriates, were looking for a way to get back into Cuba and reclaim what had been theirs, their lives. I mean, they were Cubans. They loved their country, and they were forced out by Castro and his communist thugs, and they wanted to return to Cuba. They wanted to restore Cuba to a democratic form of government. So, under Eisenhower, let's get back to our Bay of Pigs. Under Ike, we began to secretly train these expatriates. Now keep in mind, this was taking place late in the Eisenhower administration. As he leaves office and Kennedy is elected in 60 and then takes office in January 61, Kennedy becomes president in January 61. And he is then told about the plan, the attempt to train and then aid these Cuban expatriates to take Cuba from Castro. And Kennedy gives it its okay. Now again, he gives the plan, which was created under Ike, his okay. He could have said no. And to be perfectly honest, the way he handled it, he should have said no. Anyway, shortly after Kennedy becomes president, the invasion took place. The mission was a complete failure due to, and this is the most important part, due to the lack of American support, which had been promised by Kennedy. We trained well over 1,000, pushing 2,000, I believe it was. I don't remember the exact number, but I believe it was well over 1,000 of these Cuban expatriates, these men who were not mostly soldiers. Most of them were not soldiers. They were bank owners and teachers and doctors and lawyers. They were patriots, people who loved their country. When they were forced out by the Castro regime, they came to America. They were contacted by the CIA and other government agencies here in the United States, asked if they would participate. They said yes. They were secretly trained by the CIA, by the military, and the idea was to force Castro out. But due to the lack of American support, which had been promised to these expatriates by Kennedy and overtaken Cuba, it was an embarrassing foreign policy failure. It was a failure. Kennedy had promised them air support. The day or two before the invasion, we had sent in airplanes outfitted by us, flown by these expatriates. They had attacked a couple of airfields near the area where the Bay of Pigs was, where the invasion would take place, at a place called the Bay of Pigs. And we were supposed to provide air support while the invasion was taking place and then resupply. Or a way to allow them to get off the island, to remove them from the island in case it was going badly. And Kennedy did not keep up his promise. He did not keep it. So all the men who landed, again, well over 1,000, died or were captured. Those who were captured, many of them spent years in Cuban jails, which, as I'm sure you can well imagine, were not a pleasant place. Eventually, some of them were let out. Some of them were able to tell their stories to some of the other members, some of the other prisoners in jail who were able to get out and then tell the story. It was a huge embarrassment. And let's take it a step further. Let's go to our next one, number 9. Nikita Khrushchev. He was a Soviet premier. He met with JFK shortly after the Bay of Pigs. Keep in mind, who is Cuba's new buddy? The Soviet Union. Who was a Soviet Union leader? Nikita Khrushchev. When he met with JFK shortly after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, as you can well imagine, he wasn't happy, and the meeting didn't go well. Let's go to our next slide where it gets worse. So, Khrushchev meets with Kennedy shortly after the Bay of Pigs fails. He knows we were attempting to overthrow Castro, who the Russians are supporting in Cuba. Coming away from this meeting, coming away from the meeting that Khrushchev had with JFK, Khrushchev felt that JFK was weak. keep in mind, I've told you this time and time again, Khrushchev is the leader of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is an aggressor. It's a bully. What do you do to a bully? You punch it in the nose. You punch him. You punch her in the nose. If that had been done at the Munich conference with Hitler, then World War II may not have occurred. So, shortly after Khrushchev met with Kennedy, Khrushchev begins construction on the Berlin Wall. And we've talked about what the Berlin Wall is in a previous chapter. We're not going to go into great depth because, again, we've already seen it, we've already talked about it. But the Berlin Soviet-built wall around West Berlin, cutting off West Berlin from the outside world. Literally, a wall was built. And I've shown you the videos from the previous chapter when we talked about the Cold War. We talked about the killing zones, how buildings on the East Berlin side of the wall were demolished to give the guards, the East Berlin guards, the communist guards in East Berlin, more of a killing field. In addition, and this, of course, is about as important as anything, if nothing else, in addition, it stopped the flow of refugees from East Berlin who were trying to escape by getting to democratic West Berlin. We've talked about this. With the wall up, people could not escape East Berlin by getting to West Berlin. What brought all this about? Khrushchev meeting with JFK, perceiving the weakness in the man. And the man had many, many weaknesses. His unwillingness to support the Cuban expatriates when they invaded the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Now, of course, was it ever going to be successful? I don't know. Once the bombing, the day or two before the actual invasion took place, Castro freaked out. He sent a huge chunk of his military there. His secret police began to round up people who were thought to be, who were known to be, who were suspected to be not supporters of Castro, those who may actually aid the Cuban expatriates invading Cuba. Thousands of them were rounded up. And what the Cuban expatriates were hoping for was when they invaded Cuba, those people who were sympathetic to the removal of Castro would aid them, and they would create an army of 2, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 who would then overthrow the Castro regime. Well, Castro arrested all of them, and there was no one to help overthrow, no one to help the expatriates overthrow them. What should have been done then is we should have resupplied them or removed them from Cuba, helped them escape from Cuba. Kennedy did not do either. They were all killed or captured, and therefore Khrushchev thinks Kennedy is weak, and he builds the Berlin Wall. Because number one, what the heck is Kennedy going to do about it? Number two, what is Kennedy going to do about it? I think number 3, number 4, number 5 are the same thing. What is Kennedy going to do about it? He's weak, according to Khrushchev. And to be perfectly honest, he was right. Number 11, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh my God, sorry, I keep doing that. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Kennedy was elected in 61. A short time after that, we have the Bay of Pigs fiasco. A short time after that, we have the construction of the Berlin Wall. And a short time after that, what do we have? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev begins to place Soviet ICBM, Soviet rockets with nuclear weapons on them in Cuba. Okay, so after the role that the United States had played in the Bay of Pigs was made public, once our role was made public, and you got to keep in mind, not all the men who invaded Cuba were killed. Some of them were captured. And of course, they were tortured. They were interrogated. They were tortured. And they were asked questions. And under torture, they told Castro and his torturers who had supported them. So once this becomes public knowledge, Castro and Khrushchev took steps to protect Cuba. Now again, this is what Castro wants, but this is not what Khrushchev wants. Khrushchev wants a way to wipe out the United States. He wants a quick and sudden first strike. Cuba is 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Another 1,000, 1,500 miles up the Atlantic seacoast is D.C. If you can put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, the flight time from Cuba to D.C. or New York or any of the other major areas in the eastern part of the United States, from the Mississippi eastward, is down from, well, it's down to minutes. That first strike capability would allow the Soviets to attack us with a good possibility we would not be able to retaliate. We've talked about this MAD, mutually assured destruction. If I got a gun pointing at your head, you have a gun pointing at my head, neither one pulls the trigger because the other one is going to pull the trigger as well. If we launch at Soviet Union, they launch at us, we all die. But if the Cubans had nuclear weapons, nuclear-tipped missiles, if the Cubans had nuclear-tipped missiles in their backyard, put there by the Soviets, then they may be able to strike and wipe us out before we can retaliate. Okay, let's get back to how this all happened. U.S. spy planes detected the construction of the nuclear missile silos that would house the nuclear-tipped ICBMs. The United States made this information public. We went to the UN, we made it public, and Kennedy threw a naval blockade around Cuba. Of course, this is what you see at the end of the movie X-Men First Class, except without the mutants, okay? After several days of intense tension, sounds kind of redundant, but after several days of very high tension between the two powers, in which the Soviet Navy is bearing down on the American the American blockade fleet. Eventually, before that fleet of Soviet ships, probably carrying supplies to help construct the nuclear missile silos, a compromise was reached. And here are the steps of that. A, the missiles were to be removed from Cuba. Okay, first one, the Soviets promised to remove the missiles. B, U.S. promised not to invade Cuba, to leave Castro as a Soviet satellite leader. Castro is the leader of Cuba. Cuba is a communist satellite nation. So that way, the Russians still have a little bit of a footprint in the Americas. See, the United States would withdraw missiles from Turkey, which is what the Russians said we were doing to them, what they were going to do to us. We had nuclear-tipped missiles in Turkey, which would again would allow us to launch a preemptive strike against the Russians, which left them very little time to retaliate. Sort of what we said that they were doing to us by putting those missiles in Cuba. So by putting those nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, that's kind of what we had done by putting nuclear-tipped missiles in Turkey. A hotline between the United States and Russia was set up, a phone line, to allow the leader of the Soviet Union, allow the leader of the United States to talk almost instantaneously. And finally, a ban on all above-ground nuclear testing was agreed upon. Now, that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but again, it was something that Khrushchev and Kennedy saw as a way to help smooth things over. It was something that they want to see. Now, again, I realize the word adversary desktop trial is kind of in the way there, but again, what is said here, a ban on all above-ground nuclear testing was agreed upon. You can still conduct tests below ground, but just not above ground. Okay. Let's do one more slide and we'll stop. We're a little over the limit where I wanted to go. But we need to make sure we understand this. Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, he was Kennedy's VP, becomes president the same day Kennedy is assassinated, which is November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. I believe he was sworn to the presidency, he took his oath of office on the plane that carried the body of Kennedy back to D.C. The Great Society. This is a nickname given to LBJ's social programs. These programs provided a safety net for the elderly and the economically disadvantaged, very similar in many ways to the New Deal under FDR. The difference was how far the Great Society, how much farther the Great Society took this safety net, and how much it cost. The elderly, well, we're looking at things like Medicare. Economic disadvantage, we're looking at essentially the creation of the welfare state as we know it today, where the government would give people who are economically disadvantaged, and again, the government agreed upon what is that state, how much money do you have to make to be economically disadvantaged. If you fall below that number, then you can receive benefits from the government. Direct financial payments like welfare, like food stamps, what we call the Lone Star card here in Texas. Economic Opportunity Act, 1964. Keep in mind, Kennedy dies in November 63, LBJ becomes president the same day. So anything that happens after that date, this is now the LBJ presidency. And we talked about some of the things that were done during the Civil Rights era under Johnson that was only passed due to the death of Kennedy. So anyway, let's get back to this. The Economic Opportunity Act created a new government office, and that's one of the big problems with the FDR, the LBJ presidencies, the New Deal and the Great Society. They are creating new government offices, new government programs. And of course, that costs a lot of money. You have to have buildings and personnel and toilet paper and paper clips and on and on and on. And as we talked about when we discussed the New Deal, the alphabet agencies, a good chunk of the money that was to be spent to create jobs, a good chunk of the money went to overhead. And therefore, there was less money to create jobs. And of course, as I told you, that's the biggest difference between private sector jobs like Walmart and Burger King and public sector jobs, the government. Is that in a private sector jobs are better than public sector. Public sector jobs need money that comes from you and I in taxes. So we're taking from one pocket and putting money in the other pocket. Except as we're taking $10 from your right pocket to put into your left pocket, you lose $4. So you take 10 out of your right, you put 6 in your left. Those $4 are gone. That's the overhead. That is what it takes to administer these programs. And again, the difference between private and public sector. Private sector jobs are always better. Okay, so created a new government office to administer programs established by this act. And what were some of those jobs? Well, the Job Corps. This was created by the Economic Opportunity Act. The Economic Opportunity Act right there created the Job Corps. It was designed to train underprivileged youth, people your age, probably a few years older, who come from an underprivileged, economically disadvantaged background, to train them with job skills. Now, again, those job skills could be anything from dictation, secretarial skills, those types of things. Not professional. They're not going to train you to be a nuclear bomb engineer. They're not going to teach you to be a brain surgeon, but they'll teach you some job skills so you can get a job. Okay, our last one, and we've gone over time a little bit more than I really intended. The Medicare Act of 1965. Social Security, we talked about Social Security under FDR. Social Security was expanded to provide medical care, hospital insurance, and post-hospital nursing for people over 65. This is old age medical care. I do not know why it is not showing here. I do not know, but I am using all kinds of cool colors. Oh, there it goes. Okay, sorry. So let me do this again. So Social Security, expanded, provide medical care, hospital insurance, post-hospital nursing for people over 65. And as I said, this is old age insurance. If you're over the age of 65, you will be entitled to receive medical care, hospital insurance, post-hospital nursing. But of course, where does it come from? If you're over 65, you receive it. It comes from Social Security. So the Social Security money that you've been paying in, everybody's been paying Social Security since the 1935, I think it was when it kicked in. You've been paying Social Security all this time instead of going to just unemployment and benefits for people who are now retiring. It is now providing these things right here. So your Social Security payment is providing all of this stuff right in here. We are expanding Social Security. We expanded Social Security. We expanded Social Security when we created the Medicare Act of 65. It expands. It expands. It expands Social Security. Okay. I think that is more than enough. I think we've been on this for quite a time. So we're going to finish it up. This was our first part. This is part 1 of the Chapter 14 vocabulary terms.